In the archives of the South Carolina Historical Society, there is a sealed document from March 1847 that is still chilling to scholars because it contains testimony that is too upsetting to be made public. May God pardon the actions of men. The testimonies of 8 plantation owners who endured the same horrifying injuries over an 11-year period are contained within those yellowed pages. With surgical accuracy, each guy was castrated. Every one attack that takes place 24 hours after a certain unimaginable deed. The culprit was never apprehended and was never named in official documents. But rumors circulated among emancipated slaves following the Civil War about a man they called Silas the Silent, a field hand whose vocal cords were irreparably damaged and who carried out a ruthless and horrifying retaliation that even his fellow slaves were afraid to mention his name. The events that South Carolina authorities purposefully hid are being reconstructed for you to hear. An unsettling pattern of violence that made it simpler to deny its existence than to face the truth about the plantation system. I have a question for you before we move on to the tale of Silas and the 8 men who were sucked into his premeditated rage. The purpose of this channel is to share with you the most disturbing and terrible real-life tales from American history that aren't covered in textbooks. If you enjoy historical horror entertainment that doesn't hold back, click the subscribe button now. And where are you listening from, I wonder? Leave a comment mentioning your city or state. Let's now explore one of the most unsettling instances of retaliation in American history. It was not by mistake that the sealed testimony was opened. These incidents were rediscovered in 2003 because to the perseverance of a graduate student, and her studies would be plagued by what she discovered for years to come. In 1836, the low region of South Carolina was a place of paradoxes. Systematic human suffering is hidden behind breathtaking natural beauty. Built entirely on the forced labor of thousands of African Americans who worked in mosquito-infested fields where descent and malaria killed as easily as overwork, the region's rice plantations produced unprecedented wealth for a small class of white landowners, while the surrounding countryside functioned as an interconnected network of labor camps where people were bought, sold, bred, and worked to death with impunity. Charleston, 40 miles to the east, put on a show of genteel Southern culture, complete with grand balls, literary societies, and churches with towering steeples. The low-country plantation belt extended along the coastal plain, where rich soil and tidal rivers met to form the perfect environment for growing rice. However, rice farming was a taxing profession. For hours, enslaved laborers stood knee-deep in water, exposed to disease, alligators, and snakes. The jagged edges of the rice stalks tore blood off their hands. The summer heat was oppressive and the air felt heavy, with insects and humidity. Cold showers during the winter soaked through light clothing. White plantation owners were always in a state of terror, since the number of enslaved people on these plantations far outweighed the number of enslavers, often by 20 or 30 to 1. This dread showed up as harsh penalties, intricate surveillance systems, and discipline that was intended to terrorize as well as control. Around 1815, a youngster who would be named Silas was brought into the world. His mother, a woman who toiled in the fields of the Untold plantation near Georgetown, was listed as a patient in fragmentary historical records. Although plantation ledgers said that the patient's child was mulatto, suggesting a white father, the name of his father was never documented. In the strict caste system of plantation culture, this seemingly insignificant feature would turn out to be crucial. Children of white dads and enslaved mothers held a unique situation. They were legally enslaved due to their mother's status, but they also shared their oppressor father's looks, which frequently made them the target of unwelcome attention or special resentment. Silas was raised in the quarters, the cramped wooden buildings where enslaved families resided in substandard living accommodations. The buildings were hot in the summer, sweltering in the winter, and leaking in the rain. There was no privacy. Due to financial necessity, families were split up. Husbands sold wives away, children sold away from parents. There was an incalculable psychological cost to this instability. People in these communities, however, established support systems, transmitted Christian-infused African customs, performed songs that conveyed messages of resistance, and discovered methods to preserve their humanity in the face of a system that sought to eradicate it. At 7 years old, Silas was engaged in field labor. He was listed as a field hand performing minor jobs in 1822 in plantation documents from the Rutledge estate that are kept by the South Carolina Historical Society. He was working like an adult by the age of 10, According to later oral histories gathered by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s, those who knew him during these years recalled a quiet youngster who picked things up quickly and appeared to watch everything with exceptional intensity. One old person who was formerly a slave, according to an interview conducted in 1937, "My granddaddy told me about a boy named Silas, who never spoke much even as a little child, had light skin and gray eyes that looked right through you. Said that boy saw things other children didn't see, remembered things it was safer to forget." The low country of South Carolina was known for its extraordinary brutality, even among other slave states. The plantation owners became paranoid due to demographics with enslaved people, drastically outnumbering white people, particularly after the Denmark VZ conspiracy of 1822, in which Charleston police discovered a purported scheme for a large-scale slave revolt. Historians continue to argue over the magnitude of the plot, but the white response was clear. More stringent restrictions were placed on enslaved people, and 35 black men were executed, with armed white men patrolling the roadways at night and stopping any black person without a signed pass. The patrol system became more intense. It was already against the law for slaves to be literate. Even gatherings for religious purposes without white supervision were now prohibited. It was an obvious message. Overwhelming brutality would crush any form of resistance. Silas entered adolescence in this environment of increased anxiety and suppression. In 1828, at the age of 13, he experienced a life-altering event. Due to the purposeful hush that surrounds such instances, the specifics are unknown. However, according to the Rutledge Estates plantation records, Silas received medical attention for serious injuries to his throat in October of that year. Clinical and concise medical notation is used. Young slave boy, perhaps 13 years old. Vocal cords and larynx damage, cause unknown. It is advised to observe a distinct entry in a different hands plantation ledger. Notes: Silas is recuperating from a disciplinary incident and is unable to work. On plantations, the term discipline encompassed a wide range of atrocities, including mutilation, branding, and flogging. Silas was unable to speak normally after that. He was able to utter noises including grunts, murmurs, and sometimes a strangled approximation of words, according to reports collected decades later. But his voice was ruined. The harm was irreversible. It was never formally documented if this was due to intentional punishment, a beating, or some other cause. There is no doubt that starting at the age of 13, Silas the Silent, as he became known, roamed around the plantation environment as an unseen but eerily unnerving presence. Some supervisors found him less dangerous since he couldn't communicate, while others found him more unsettling. In plain sight, he was a ghost, working without complaining and observing without making any remarks. Instead of using gang labor, the Rutledge plantation, like others in the area, used a task system. Every day, enslaved laborers were given certain assignments. They had to thresh a specific amount of rice, build ditches, hoe a field, and then, in theory, have their own time. In reality, people were frequently forced to labor late into the evening because duties could not be finished during the day. However, the small pockets of autonomy, gardens where enslaved people could grow their own food, and chances to make meager sums of money by selling extra fruit or fish caught in rivers were all made possible under the system. These minor liberties, which created areas where people may exercise choice, were essential for psychological existence. Oral accounts indicate that Silas spent his evenings in a different way than other people. He observed. He paid attention. People forgot he was there because of his silence. Additionally, he gained knowledge from that invisibility. He discovered the overseer's habits, including which ones drank excessively and which ones spent the night in the quarters. He became aware of the patrol riders' routines and the holes in their routes. He discovered which plantation owners traveled to other estates and for what purposes. He also discovered that, although it was not discussed publicly, some of the enslavers' males viewed enslaved women and occasionally enslaved boys as sexual property, which entailed ownership rights. It wasn't until long later that the whole importance of the first occurrence, which happened on a sultry night in August 1836, became clear. Nathaniel Grayson, a 32-year-old plantation owner whose land bordered the Rutledge estate, was the victim. At daybreak, Grayson's wife discovered him in his bedroom, blood seeping through the bed linens, conscious but in shock. Almost surgical precision, according to the treating physician, had been used to castrate him. From the inside, the bedroom door had been secured. The windows had been locked and shuttered. Beyond the injury itself, there was no indication of struggle or forceful entry. When he was able to talk, Grayson said he had woken up to a hand covering his lips, a flash of metal, and such severe pain that he passed out. All he could see and hear was the steady, controlled sound of breathing. With the help of the slave patrol, Benjamin Carr, the local sheriff, conducted an investigation. Grayson questioned all of the slaves on his estate. On suspicion, a number were beaten, a standard procedure intended more to regain authority than to elicit information. Nothing of value surfaced. No slave had been in the house that night, according to Grayson's wife. When asked separately, the housekeepers acknowledged that they had been kept in their rooms at dark, which was a custom Grayson adhered to religiously. Within days, the investigation came to a standstill, and despite rumors of abolitionist plots and theories of retaliation circulating throughout white society, no one was arrested. The events of the previous afternoon were left out of the sheriff's report because Grayson would not discuss them. A young guy named Silas, a fieldan from the nearby Rutledge farm, had been loaned to Grayson for the day to help fix a rice mill. These short-term transfers were typical. They were a way for plantation owners to support one another. The task had taken until nightfall, and instead of sending Silas back in the dark, Grayson had housed him in a storage shed close to the main house for the night. Around 10 o'clock that night, Grayson had gone to that shed. He spent about 30 minutes there. Silas appeared behind him, moving slowly, his expression unreadable as he came out, straightening his clothes. At first light, Grayson instructed his overseer to bring Silas back to the Rutledge plantation. That was the final clear command he issued prior to the assault. There was no connection. Silas's presence on the site was never mentioned by Grayson himself. In order to do so, he would have had to provide an explanation for his late-night excursion to the shed, which would have generated issues Grayson didn't intend to address. Some things were accepted but never acknowledged in the honor culture of the Southern plantation aristocracy. Having sex with enslaved people was both a common behavior and an unspoken fact. Openly discussing it went against social norms that upheld the myth of white gentility. Thus, Grayson endured his suffering in quiet, before later informing others that an unidentified intruder, possibly a fugitive slave, had attacked him after inexplicably breaking into his locked chamber. Silas went back to the plantation owned by Rutledge. He was a field worker. Since he was unable to speak, he remained silent. There was no expression on his face. Life went on. It was 18 months. In February 1838, however, there was an incident. Thomas Wright, who owned a medium-sized plantation 12 miles south of the Rutledge property, was the victim this time. Wright, a well-respected member of his local church, was 41 years old, married, and had 4 children. His overseer discovered him castrated in the exact same way as Grayson in the plantation office, a tiny structure apart from the main house. From within, the door had been bolted. Wright fainted from shock and blood loss. Although he lived, he was still unable to give a detailed account of his assailant. "I don't remember anything," he said. The next thing he knew, he was waking up in pain after working late on account books. The sheriff conducted another investigation. The parallels to the Grayson case were observed this time. Both plantation owners attacked in closed rooms. Both of them were unable to identify their assailant and suffered the same injuries. There were several theories: a planned slave uprising, abolitionists' campaign, a troubled person's resentment of the planter class. The area's enslaved population was once more the focus of the investigation, especially those who had shown any intelligence or spirit independence that may indicate the ability to commit such a crime. Before being released due to a lack of evidence, a number of guys were detained for weeks, subjected to severe interrogation, and arrested. Once more, a crucial detail was overlooked. Wright had gone to Georgetown for business 2 days before to the incident. He had negotiated the temporary hire of a carpenter and enslaved labor while there. In an effort to increase revenue, the Rutledge plantation had started leasing some of its more experienced slaves to other plantation owners for short-term tasks. Despite being mute, Silas was seen as a capable worker since he had acquired carpentry abilities. He had been dispatched to fix damage to a number of outbuildings on Wright's plantation. It took 3 days to complete. Silas worked diligently from sunrise to sunset, ate meals provided to him by the plantation cook, and slept in a secured tool shed. Wright came to the tool shed on the second night. He lingered for a while, Silas stayed inside when he departed. Silas finished his task the following day and went back to the Untold plantation. Wainwright was discovered castrated in his office the following day. Since no one was seeking a connection, none was formed. The notion that a slave in the perspective of plantation society, it was unimaginable for a person, especially one who was mute, unable to cry out, or even tell anybody what was happening to him, to be capable of such planned retaliation. People in slavery were property, unable to think strategically enough to commit such crimes. That they suffered was accepted without concern, and the possibility that they would retaliate with deliberate violence was unthinkable. However, rumors started to circulate throughout the Low Country's enslaved communities. There was a pattern of knowing looks and deliberate silences, but nothing overt, traceable, or admissible as proof. The references to Silas's name alluded to more than just his carpentry abilities. We knew there was somebody making those white men pay. An older woman interviewed decades later recounted, "We didn't know for certain who, but there was talk about a man who couldn't speak, who moved like a shadow. People were afraid of him, but not in the same sense that they would be afraid of something malevolent. It's more akin to being afraid of a hurricane. It's coming, you know. You simply attempt to avoid being in its way since you know it's strong." 4 plantation owners in the low region of South Carolina had met the same end by 1840. Every attack had the same pattern: locked rooms, surgical accuracy, no indication of forced entrance, and no helpful description of the assailant. On the surface, there was little connection between the victims, Grayson, Wainwright, and now Edmund Talbot and Henry Prescott. They belonged to diverse social circles, owned plantations of varying sizes, and were of varying ages. Geography was the only thing that bound them together. Everyone resided within 20 meters radius. They were all a part of the region's interwoven rice plantation economic network. The planter class had become fearful as a result of the attacks. Doors that were locked no longer seemed safe. Once taken for granted, the existence of enslaved persons in and around homes now caused paranoia. A few plantation owners started sleeping with their weapons loaded. Others upped the severity of their control measures, recruited more overseers, and put more locks in an effort to scare off any assailants. Slave patrols increased the frequency of their nighttime rides, stopping and interrogating any black person they came across on the roadways after nightfall. However, the attacks persisted, with erratic timing but constant methodology. Since the plantation owners had never kept track of the movement of enslaved people between plantations, they were unaware of the fact that Silas had been found on every property in the days leading up to each assault. Renting out skilled enslaved labor had become a lucrative side industry for the Untold farm, and Silas, with his carpentry skills and his eerie stillness, was often loaned to other plantations for temporary work. To those who hired his labor, he was invisible, a tool rather than a human being. Although the pattern existed, it was never recorded in any formal documents. Silas would come to a plantation, work hard for a few days, sleep wherever he was given, which is typically a shed or storage structure apart from the main slave quarters, and finish his work quickly. Additionally, on some of these plantations, not all of them, but some, a specific owner would pay him a visit at night. What transpired during those visits was never talked about, never documented, and only lived in the icy calculation of the one who recalled and the secret torment of others who went through it. The man who had visited him would then be found castrated, frequently in a confined room, 48 hours after Silas returned to the Untold property. The attack was carried out so quickly and stillness so quiet that a woman sleeping in the same house could not even be able to hear it. No one linked the attacks, thus the investigation as it was remained disjointed. Every event was handled independently and looked into by local officials who had inadequate communication with their counterparts in nearby jurisdictions. After looking into the first 2 incidents, Sheriff Carr was now certain that he was dealing with a serial killer. However, he encountered opposition when he tried to organize a more extensive inquiry. Owners of plantations were hesitant to publicly discuss the attacks, a combination of embarrassment about their wounds and apprehension about inciting slave revolts or other such crimes. Brief accounts of violent incidents on low country plantations were published in the South Carolina Gazette, but material that could incite fear or provide potential attackers information was purposefully left out. A particular type of information was shared in the communities of enslaved people. People were aware of the targeting of specific plantation owners, They were aware that whatever was taking place was a form of justice. Their judicial system would never deliver. Encoded language was used by enslaved women to describe the silent one who made men pay, especially those who had been sexually assaulted by white males on multiple occasions. However, they were equally aware that publicly applauding or even admitting these assaults would result in group punishment. Slave patrols would comb the neighborhood after every incident, questioning people, destroying property, and periodically using violence to regain control. Thus, the information stayed hidden, whispered, never recorded, and never said in a place where it could be overheard. Even the people who shared the ruddled quarters with Silas were baffled by him. He ate his rations, slept in his designated spot, and worked steadily. On the plantation, he had no family. He had never known siblings, and his mother's patients had passed away from fever in 1830. He didn't make any close friends and didn't become involved in the quarter's communal life too much. His quiet served as a barrier as well as an explanation. How can you become friends with someone who is mute, whose eyes seem to look through you instead than at you, and whose face lacks discernible emotion? In 1936, an old man named Joshua, who had spent years working in the rice fields with Silas, told an interviewer, Silas was different from other people. At a young age, something happened to him. It destroyed his voice, but it broke him even more on the inside. He would cut rice until his hands bled all day in the sweltering heat without making a sound. At first, overseers appreciated that. Despite the fact that he was broken, there was something about his eyes that unnerved intelligent people. He never stopped watching, as if he could see things that the rest of us couldn't. And there was something about the way he gazed at some white males that reminded you of deep water, the kind that slowly drowns you. Silas was officially owned by the ruddled plantation owners, who had no suspicions about him. He was quiet and submissive, a valued asset, a skilled worker who might be hired out for extra cash. In fact, he seemed more reliable because he couldn't talk. He was unable to organize resistance, disseminate rumors, or even call out for help if he was in danger. He was in, they saw, the perfect slave, productive, quiet, and completely subdued. Control, however, was a myth. Years of observation and painful experience had taught Silas the ins and outs of plantation life. He was aware of the patterns of black constraint and white mobility, as well as the rhythms of plantation life. He was aware that slaves were supposed to be in specific locations at specific times, and that any departure from the norm raised suspicions and penalty. He was aware that he was forgettable because of his stillness, which left him exposed. In his presence, overseers would talk openly about topics they would never bring up in front of slaves they thought could spread rumors. White men, sure that a silent slave was not a danger, would utilize him and then forget about him. They were utterly mistaken. By 1842, there were now 6 people. Charles Hammond and Robert Finch, 2 additional plantation owners, had been added to the list of fatalities. The attacks could no longer be written off as isolated acts of violence. An editorial in the Charleston Mercury urged a coordinated probe, implying that the planter class was being targeted by a disturbed individual or group of dissidents. Information was rewarded. Although the governor approved more militia resources to aid local law police, the inquiry stalled because nearly all of the victims refused to share key information. None would talk about what they had been doing in the hours leading up to the attacks. None would admit that certain enslaved laborers were present on their grounds. Admitting to actions that were supposed to stay unsaid but were common would have been necessary to do so. The Southern elite's honor culture placed a high priority on reputation. Although a male could freely rape enslaved girls and boys, it was considered socially unacceptable to publicly admit such crimes. Ignoring the truth is preferable to suffering in quiet. Silas was better protected by this quiet than by any conscious scheme. The design was, they were just waiting to be found, but nobody with the power to look into it was prepared to look in the right direction. The attacks persisted, each one a precise, deliberate act of retaliation that left the victim alive but damaged, unable to identify his attacker but able to know what had been done to him. An unexpected witness who threatened to blow everything up appeared just when the probe appeared to be hopelessly blocked. The night Charles Hammond was attacked, Denina, a housekeeper on the Hammond farm, had witnessed something that, despite her best efforts, she was unable to forget. Dina, who had been enslaved on several low-country plantations her entire life, was 34 years old in 1842. She had been sold twice, once as a young woman when a plantation went bankrupt, and once as a toddler when her original owner passed away. Her third bondage location was the Hammond Plantation. She held a complex position in the plantation hierarchy as a house servant. Compared to field hands, house slaves typically had better food, better clothes, and less physically taxing labor. However, there were dangers associated with being close to white proprietors. Housekeepers were particularly vulnerable since they witnessed and heard things like marital disputes, financial difficulties, and secret cruelties. For those who were slaves, knowledge was deadly. You could be killed, beaten, or sold if you saw something you weren't allowed to see. Dina had been sleeping in a little room off the kitchen the night Charles Hammond had attacked. As was usual for the chief domestic servant and cook, she heard something when she got up to use the chamber pot at around 2 in the morning, a sound so faint that she nearly thought she had made it up. It was a footstep. Some of the stairs of the ancient staircase, predictably, it creaked. Dina had climbed those stairs many times every day, so she was familiar with such sounds. She could hear someone moving cautiously and gently, testing each step to reduce noise. She ought to have remained in her chamber. All of her survival instincts advised her to keep quiet, to see nothing, to know nothing. But she was drawn to the doorway by curiosity or maybe a deeper intuition. She lit a solitary candle and shielded its light with her palm, leaving the rest of the house dark. She shifted to the area where the staircase was visible. At the top, hardly discernible in the shadows, was a figure. The sleek masculine silhouette was approaching Hammond's bedroom with deliberate caution. Dina's heart paused for a second, believing she was watching a murder unfold. The figure then turned slightly, and for a brief moment his face was illuminated by candlelight. She knew who he was. For the past 3 days, Silas, the carpenter from the Untold plantation, has been fixing the gallery railings and a number of window frames on the property. Everyone thought he had been locked in the tool shed every night. He had obviously figured out a way out. Dina stood motionless in the doorway, watching. Silas arrived at the door of Hammond's bedroom. She thought it would be locked. Paranoid about the recent attacks on plantation owners, Hammond locked his door every night, but it opened without a sound. Inside, Silas crept. The door shut. Dina stood indecisively, paralyzed. Something blocked her from waking up, even though someone should have set off an alarm. Maybe it was the recollection of Hammond's he chose ladies with the casual authority of a market vendor, picking fruit on visits to the quarters. Maybe it was the fact that she didn't want to be involved in whatever was going to happen. Maybe it was acknowledgement that the silent man who had just walked into that bedroom was bringing about a sort of justice that the court system would never be able to offer. She went back to her room. She listened while she lay awake. There was still silence in the home. There was only utter and profound silence, no shouts, no struggle, no noises of violence. Just before morning, Dina was in the kitchen preparing breakfast and lighting the fire when Hammond's agonizing groaning started. She was present when turmoil broke out in the home, and Hammond's wife started yelling when the doctor was called. Additionally, Dina remained silent about what she had witnessed, the figure on the stairs and Silas entering the locked bedroom when the sheriff came to question everyone. However, when people wait with knowledge that could either save or condemn them, silence can fester. Throughout the rest of 1842 and 1843, Dina held on to what she had learned, watching Silas with a mixture of fear and almost awe whenever he returned to the Hammond estate for more work. She was sure he knew she had seen him, yet he never gave her more than the tiniest flicker of acknowledgement. They both held information and lived in mutual silence. That might ruin the other. The seventh assault took place in November 1843. The victim was Daniel Merrick, a very violent plantation owner who was infamous even by local standards. A sizable plantation close to the Waccamaw River belonged to Merrick. Over 40 slaves labored in rice fields, producing significant income. He was well known for using stocks, thumbscrews, and cruel whippings for small transgressions. He was also notorious for having a voracious hunger for both young males and enslaved women. On his property, the slave population lived in continual fear. In early November, Silas had been dispatched to Merrick's plantation to build a new structure for the storage of rice harvesting equipment. 10 days were needed to complete the project. Silas worked mechanically, separated his meals from the other slaves, and slept in a locked corn crib. Merrick went to the corn crib the third night he was there. Only 2 persons knew what had transpired during that visit. However, his overseer discovered Merrick in the plantation office, castrated with the now familiar accuracy. 9 days after Silas had finished his task and gone back to the Ruddled property. 7 plantation owners had been attacked by now. The pattern ought to have been clear, but it was concealed because the relevant data was dispersed throughout several plantations, various legal jurisdictions, and various social circles with inadequate communication. Although the victims had established a loose connection and met periodically to exchange ideas and information, they were unable to recognize the pattern because of their embarrassment and reluctance to divulge specifics. They were aware that someone who knew their houses and habits in great detail was targeting them, but they were unable or unwilling to recognize the pattern. That Silas, the quiet carpenter who went between plantations like a ghost, working hard, paying close attention and remembering everything, was a recurring theme. He has spent years refining his approach, determined the areas where he was most at risk. During his job, he made incidental observations to ascertain the layout of the plantation cottages, take note of the patrol and supervisor movement patterns. He would then break out of whichever structure or shed he was imprisoned in at night when the time came. With the correct tools, locks were simple mechanisms that were easy to manipulate. Additionally, he had access to tools because he was a carpenter, and he made his way to his target's home. It took perseverance and close attention to detail to enter locked homes. When Silas was working on a property, would make a note of which doors had insufficient locks, which windows had loose frames, and where the keys were stored. Despite their magnificence, he discovered that many plantation homes lacked adequate security. The purpose of locks was to keep slaves out, but they were frequently outdated, badly maintained, and opened using skeleton keys that could be made by a talented carpenter. If you knew which windows had loose fittings, you could shim them open from the outside. As someone who had studied his terrain, Silas strolled confidently once inside. He was aware of where the floorboards groaned, which rooms were inhabited, and where servants slept. He also knew that his targets would either be by themselves or, if they were with wives, that they would be restless sleepers, frequently with the help of the lordom that many affluent women of the time frequently used. He would stealthily enter the bedroom, walk over to the sleeping guy, and then, in one quick motion, cover his victim's face with a cloth drenched in chloroform that he had stolen from plantation medical supplies while working during the day. After a moment of fight, the man would faint. Silas would get things done fast. Then, using surgical instruments he had carefully obtained and concealed, the castration was carried out with a level of accuracy that betrayed medical expertise. However, it was still unclear where Silas had acquired these abilities. He would be gone in a matter of minutes, sneaking back out of the home the way he had come in and going back to his closed shed to spend the last few hours before sunrise. The victim's poor memory was explained by the chloroform. The operation. The majority survived because of precision. Murder would result in a much more thorough investigation, but Silas had no interest in that. His retaliation was targeted. To rob these men of what they had stolen from him and others, to leave a lasting reminder of their transgressions, to alter sexual predators into shattered, devastated beings who would never attack another person. Dina's information was still a ticking time bomb, though. Early in 1844, everything would change when she made a choice. She went up to Reverend Thomas Clayton, a Presbyterian pastor who served a number of plantation churches in the Low Country, and was known for being a reformer who occasionally discussed the ethical issues surrounding slavery with great attention. An unusual request from an enslaved person to a white clergyman was Denina's desire for a private conversation. Intrigued and a little wary, Clayton consented to see her in the chapel of the Hammond plantation. Dina was cautious and incomplete in what she told him that afternoon in February 1844. At first, she didn't mention Silas by name, but she did mention seeing a man who shouldn't have been in the Hammond home the night of the attack. She explained how he had entered a closed room, how he moved carefully, and how he was silent. She informed Clayton that she thought this same man was behind the other assaults, that he was retaliating for something horrible, and that he moved between plantations. What that something was, she did not state precisely, in order to do so, admitting that the plantation system was rife with organized sexual abuse and doing so could result in her death. However, she gave a hint, and Clayton, who was more observant than many of his contemporaries, recognized it. Clayton had to make a tough decision. If he informed the police what Denina had told him, she would undoubtedly face consequences, possibly even death, for delaying coming forward. Most certainly, the offender would be apprehended and put to death. Clayton, however, was sufficiently morally imaginative to see that he was dealing with more than just criminal activity. It was retaliation for long-term institutionalized maltreatment. Months after seeing the attack, he questioned Dina about why she was telling him this now. She gave a straightforward response, considering that there will be more. When he goes through, I can see it in him. And perhaps anything can change if someone is aware of what's actually going on. Clayton's choice went against every societal norm of his era and location. He didn't tell the authorities anything. Rather, he started his own covert research, visiting other estates and interviewing slaves while posing as a religious minister in order to get accounts that supported Dina's theories. He became aware of a Silas as a quiet carpenter. At night, he heard, plantation owners would go to locked-out buildings. He discovered a horrifying trend that the white establishment will not recognize as doing so would mean facing the system's most profound moral decay. Clayton was not prepared for the attention his investigation would bring. In a culture that relies heavily on monitoring and control, a white minister posing thoughtful queries regarding concerns were aroused by the private actions of plantation owners. By the summer of 1844, Clayton was summoned to a Georgetown committee of concerned people, who asked him about his activities and cautioned him that his meddling in plantation discipline was undesirable. He was informed in unambiguous terms that his ability to remain a minister in the Low Country rested only on his judgment and his readiness to uphold the status quo rather than challenge it. Augustine Sheffield, a well-known plantation owner, was one committee member who was very forthright. We recognize that you have been posing inquiries concerning issues unrelated to anyone's spiritual well-being, Reverend. Inquiries that imply you've lost sight of your role and goal in this situation. That can be fixed or it can be determined. You have an option. Clayton recognized the danger. He halted his inquiry, or at least seemed to, but he kept thorough private diaries in which he recorded all he had discovered. He wrote in a specialized shorthand that he felt would safeguard the material in the event that his documents were ever confiscated. The most comprehensive modern account of what was truly occurring in the Low Country between 1836 and 1847 can be found in these journals, which were found in a Charleston estate sale in 1998. Clayton stated in an August 1844 entry, "I have discovered the identity of the man they are looking for, but they are unsure of who they are looking for. His name is Silas, and he is a skilled carpenter who works for the Ruddled estate. I have discovered that the reason he is mute is because of the violence he endured when he was 13 years old. God pardon me, but I cannot condemn him. The law would hang him without hesitation. I have learned what has been done to him repeatedly since by men who saw his silence as an invitation rather than an injury, and I have learned what he has done in response. This is something I cannot bring myself to write even in this private record. Even though I am supposed to preach forgiveness and redemption, I find myself hoping that he is never caught, and that his terrible justice lasts until every man who has wronged him pays in full." In the meantime, Silas carried on with his work, not realizing that anyone had started to. The Ruddled Plantation continued to make money by renting out their talented carpenter, and Silas kept moving between properties, a silent presence that white society had learned to ignore entirely. But something was changing in him. The elderly, formerly enslaved people interviewed in the 1930s described a man who appeared to be gradually fading away, even as he remained physically present. One woman recalled that he became thinner, as if he were burning up from the inside. In March 1847, the eighth and final attack took place, and it would prove different from all the others in ways that would finally force the truth into the open. His eyes grew darker and deeper, and you would look at him and feel as though you were looking into a well without a bottom. Some people began to avoid him, not because they believed he had hurt them, but because being around him felt like being near something that had already died, but forgot to stop moving. In contrast to the earlier victims who had been reluctant to discuss their attacks publicly, Jonathan Caldwell, a 47-year-old plantation owner whose property sat along the Black River, one of the most lucrative rice-growing regions in South Carolina, was the target. Caldwell was wealthy even by planter standards, owning more than 60 enslaved people and extensive land holdings, and he was a member of the state legislature, which gave him considerable political influence and protection. He was untouchable because of his political connections. In early March 1847, Caldwell signed a contract with the Ruddled Plantation to borrow Silas for a month-long project that would require him to work on the Caldwell Plantation for a longer period of time than any of his previous assignments, building a new overseer's house and renovating several slave quarters that had fallen into disrepair. The Rutland estate manager, pleased with the large rental fee Caldwell was offering, agreed right away, and Silas was taken to the Caldwell Plantation on March 3rd, as well as the equipment and supplies he would require. The Caldwell Plantation was bigger and more violent than others, and its overseer, Horace Strickland, was infamous for his violence. He always carried a whip and used it freely. The enslaved people lived in continual fear, worked until they were exhausted, and endured punishments for both imagined and real transgressions. Silas was allocated to sleep in a small workshop apart from the main quarters, a building where tools were stored and minor repairs completed, a wooden structure with a heavy lock on the door and bars on the single window. In recent years, people had died in the fields from overwork and untreated injuries. The atmosphere was oppressive, heavy with the kind of despair that comes from knowing no relief is possible. Caldwell had noticed Silas almost immediately, and his attention carried a quality that anyone familiar with plantation dynamics would recognize. And on the second evening of Silas's stay, Caldwell went to the workshop after dark. He had made it a point to lock Silas in every night, checking the lock twice and warning him that any attempt to escape would result in a whipping that would leave him unable to work for weeks. Silas showed no reaction to these threats, simply nodding his understanding and going about his work during the day with the same mechanical efficiency he brought to every project. Over the next few weeks, Caldwell would return to the workshop 2 or 3 times a week, always after dark, always staying. He stayed for over an hour, leaving his clothes rumpled and his face flushed. Silas stayed inside, standing still close to the workbench, his face unreadable in the faint light of a single candle. Strickland, the overseer, also saw, but he responded by making sure Silas remained locked in securely, not to protect Silas but to protect Caldwell's privacy, and to make sure this valuable rented property didn't escape before finishing the work that Caldwell had paid for. The other enslaved people on the plantation noticed as they noticed everything, but they said nothing because discussing such things was suicidal. Silas had been patient for 11 years, striking and disappearing, never caught, never even suspected, but something had changed in him during those years. The meticulous calculation that had marked his earlier attacks giving way to something darker, more desperate. That this time Silas had been planning something different. The long duration of the project, the remote location of the workshop, the frequency of Caldwell's visits, all of these factors created an opportunity that had not existed with previous targets. Silas didn't wait for Caldwell to leave the workshop on the night of March 24th, but this time he didn't intend to slip out later, to enter a locked house while everyone slept, to finish his work in silence and vanish before dawn. He was 32 years old, had spent half his life as a silent instrument of other people's desires and his own retaliation, and was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. Caldwell finished his attack and started to get dressed this time, so Silas moved. The attack was quick and vicious. He had a carpenter's hammer hidden under his sleeping pallet, and he used it to hit Caldwell across the back of the head with enough force to stun, but not kill him. Caldwell collapsed, still conscious but confused and unable to scream out. Silas worked quickly, binding Caldwell's hands and feet with rope from his carpentry supplies and putting a rag in his mouth to muffle any noises. What followed took almost an hour. Unlike the previous attacks, which had been carried out with quick precision while victims were unconscious, this time Silas worked slowly, methodically, while Caldwell was fully aware. He then lit every candle in the workshop, creating an unusual, almost ritualistic brightness, and he retrieved the surgical tools he had meticulously maintained over the years, cleaned and sharpened after each use, kept hidden in a secret compartment in his tool chest. It was a planned, purposeful act of torture, a complete reversal of power, and for perhaps the first time in his privileged life, Caldwell realized what it meant to be completely helpless, to have your body violated while you were powerless to stop it. It was carried out in stages with lengthy pauses in between each cut, during which Silas would simply stare at Caldwell's face, watching the terror and pain, making no sound himself, but making sure his victim understood exactly what was happening and why. When Silas was done, he cleaned his tools carefully, put them away, and did something he had never done before. He unlocked the workshop door from the inside and walked out into the night without trying to hide or go back to the locked building before dawn, Traversing the plantation yard, past the main house where lamps still burned in some windows, past the quarters where enslaved people lay awake, listening to at sunrise, Strickland, the overseer, found Caldwell in the workshop screaming through his gag, barely conscious from shock and blood loss, and immediately organized a search, expecting to chase an escaped slave through the swamps. He walked to the edge of the plantation property, to the river that marked the boundary, and he stood there looking at the dark water as the first light of dawn began to gray the eastern sky. When Strickland and 3 other white men, all armed, approached, Silas did not try to flee. Instead, he turned to face them. Later, Strickland would tell people that the look in Silas's eyes was the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. Not anger, not madness, but something colder and emptier, like looking into the eyes of a man who had already left his body behind. Silas was standing calmly by the river, his hands still stained with blood, his face displaying no emotion, fear, or regret. If this story is chilling you, share this video with someone who enjoys dark historical mysteries. Click the like button to support content that doesn't shy away from the brutal truths of American history. To fully comprehend the scope of this horror, keep in mind that Caldwell was the 8th victim we know about. How many others might there have been? Attacks that went unreported, victims too ashamed to admit what had happened to them. Let's see what happened when the truth finally surfaced. They arrested Silas right away, shackled him with irons on his wrists and ankles, and locked him in a storage shed on the Caldwell plantation while they made a decision. Remember to subscribe. We have more stories like this one, tales that history tried to bury. Sheriff Carr, who had been looking into these attacks for over 10 years, went straight to the Caldwell plantation, and for the first time he had an actual suspect in custody. He survived like all the previous victims, but the injury was catastrophic and permanent. News of the attack spread quickly throughout the Low Country, and for the first time the authorities started to seriously investigate whether this might be connected to the previous incidents. The next day, March 26, 1847, interrogation began in a small room in the Georgetown courthouse where Silas had been transferred under heavy guard. With Sheriff Carr, 2 deputies, the district attorney, and Reverend Clayton, who had been called at Carr's request because he was known to have the trust of enslaved people and might be able to get Silas to communicate despite his inability to speak, present. The interrogation transcript, which is part of the sealed documents later archived by the South Carolina Historical Society, is a chilling read. Silas was brought in chains into the room. His hands shackled to a ring bolted into the Sheriff Carr started off by asking direct questions. Did you attack Jonathan Caldwell? Did you castrate him? Silas nodded slowly in response to both questions, displaying no emotion and no attempt to flee. He sat motionless on the floor, his damaged throat occasionally making uncontrollable noises but no words. Responsibility. The men in the room looked at each other. They had suspected, but confirmation was different. Then Carr asked the crucial question, have you done this before? Are you responsible for the other attacks? Silas stared at him for a long moment, then nodded again. Carr persisted, how many? How many men have you attacked? Silas raised both hands, fingers outstretched. 8. Carr's gut grew chilly. Why? Then Reverend Clayton had brought paper and pencil, believing that Silas would be able to write. But when he presented them, Silas shook his head, saying that he couldn't read or write, that it was against the law for enslaved people to be literate, and that he had never been taught. Why did you do this? Then Clayton tried something different, asking yes or no questions to which Silas would nod or shake his head. The ensuing conversation, which was reconstructed from Clayton's journal and the official transcript, showed the pattern that had been concealed by silence and shame the entire time. Did these men hurt you? Silas nodded in response to Clayton's question. Did they force themselves? On you? All 8 of them. Nod. Did this happen to you when you were young? When your voice was damaged? Nod. And it continued to happen whenever you were sent to work on other plantations. Silas's nod was slower this time, but it was still firm. The room went silent, and then the district attorney, a man named Harrison Felder, spoke. Clayton turned to face Sheriff Carr. Sheriff, I think we need to look into the circumstances under which these attacks occurred. I think this man has been subjected to systematic sexual violence for nearly 20 years, and what he did was retaliation. Even if what you say is true, and I'm not denying that it is, it doesn't matter. This man mutilated 8 white men of standing. He'll hang for this. But Carr was looking at Silas with an expression that said he was finally understanding something he had been purposefully avoiding for years. "That's not a legal defense, Reverend. Slaves have no legal right to retaliate against their masters for any reason. The pattern," he said slowly, "was that he was on every property just before every attack. If we had been examining the movement of rented slaves years ago, we could have discovered this connection, but we chose not to do so because we were afraid of what we might discover." He turned to Felder and said, "If we put him on trial, if this becomes public, every detail will come out." Felder instantly understood that a public trial would necessitate testimony about what the victims had done to Silas, would necessitate acknowledging the systemic sexual violence that pervaded the plantations, and would ask why he was sent there, what happened to him while he was there, and why 8 respectable plantation owners all had this silent slave in their possession just before they were attacked. Felder asked thoughtfully, "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," Carr said, "that we document what we need to document, that we close the case because it would be humiliating for the victims, disruptive to the social order, and possibly inspire other enslaved people to active resistance. It would be better to handle this quietly to avoid the publicity that would come from a trial. The official record would indicate that Silas, a property of the Rutledge Plantation, had confessed to 8 counts of assault on plantation owners between 1836 and 1847, with the motive listed as unknown or general rebellious disposition, the specifics of what had been done to Silas, what had motivated his attacks in such cases as solved, and that we handle the punishment without a public spectacle that serves no one's interests." Reverend Clayton refused to let it rest there, and during the days between Silas's interrogation and his scheduled execution, he paid him 2 visits in his cell, bringing paper and pencil, and the victims would not be asked to testify about their private activities. The pattern would be noted but not explained, and Silas would be executed quietly and without public announcement to avoid making a martyr or inciting imitation attacks. When Clayton asked Silas if there was anything he wanted people to know, anything he wanted Clayton to record for history, Silas stared at him for a long time before reaching for the pencil Clayton had brought, and despite his inability to write, he managed to draw something, not words, but images while sitting with him in silence, trying to provide some sort of spiritual comfort to a man who had experienced horrors Clayton could hardly understand. Clayton realized that the 8 crosses, which stood for Silas's victims but also for something else, looked like darkness. A boy's face with his mouth open, screaming, a hand covering that mouth, and then 8 crosses scratching heavily into the paper, followed by nothing more. The execution was set for April 15, 1847, at dawn in the Georgetown Courthouse Square, and Clayton carefully preserved the drawing in his journal, where it remains to this day, a stark visual testimony to violence that official records tried to erase. Silas had taken back some measure of power 8 times, making his attackers feel a fraction of what he had felt. It wasn't justice in any legal sense, but it was the only justice Silas had ever been able. The cell was allegedly under constant guard, but 2 days prior to the planned date, something unexpected occurred. Silas was discovered dead in his cell, and the official cause of death was listed as suicide by hanging using strips of cloth torn from his blanket. But there were inconsistencies in the report that raised questions then and still do now. It would have taken a long time to tear and braid the strips of cloth into a rope strong enough to. It was never officially determined whether Silas killed himself or if he was killed to avoid a public execution that might attract unwanted attention. His body was buried in an unmarked grave in the cemetery designated for enslaved people, a location that has since been lost to development and time. There is no headstone, no memorial, nothing to mark the grave. Additionally, several witnesses to the body reported bruising around the throat that seemed inconsistent with self-inflicted hanging. Jonathan Caldwell resigned from the state legislature shortly after his recovery, citing health reasons. Silas the Silent finally found silence in death. The 8 plantation owners who survived Silas's attacks lived with their injuries and their shame for the rest of their lives. Some of them left the area, moving to other states where their histories were unknown, while others stayed but became reclusive, their damaged bodies constant reminders of what they had done and what had been done to them in return. The Rutledge Plantation remained in operation until 1865, when the Union Army's occupation of South Carolina effectively ended slavery in the region. He sold his plantation in 1849 and moved to Virginia, where he died in 1856, leaving no public record of what had happened to him. The first victim, Nathaniel Grayson, lived until 1861, long enough to witness the start of the Civil War that would eventually destroy the system that had enabled his crimes. He never married, never publicly discussed his attack, and died alone and isolated in the house where it had taken place. No records remain of what happened to the enslaved people who had lived there, including those who had known Silas, worked with him, or perhaps even suspected what he was doing during those 11 years. The plantation buildings were burned during the war, and the land was eventually divided and sold. After being freed, they dispersed, looking for family members who had been sold away and attempting to start over in a society that promised freedom in theory but little in reality. Some of their descendants still reside in the Low, though few are aware of their ties to this history. Reverend Thomas Clayton continued his ministry in South Carolina until 1852, when he resigned and relocated to Pennsylvania, where he could work more freely with abolitionist groups. His daughter inherited his journals, carefully preserved them but never published them because she recognized that the stories they contained were too shocking, too dangerous, and too contradictory to the narratives about slavery that both the North and the South wanted to tell. Before being donated to a historical society, where they were largely unexplored until the late 20th century, those journals went through several generations of Clayton's descendants. The sealed document containing the official record of Silas's crimes and execution was placed in the archives of the South Carolina Historical Society in 1847, with a restriction that it could not be opened without special permission, a restriction that was in effect for more than 150 years. When a graduate student named Michelle as part of her dissertation research on plantation violence, Torres eventually obtained access to the document in 2003. She discovered that, in addition to Silas's story, dozens of other documented cases of enslaved people resisting their treatment in ways ranging from subtle sabotage to outright violence were purposefully hidden in official records to avoid. Torres's dissertation, published in 2006, acknowledged that enslaved people had agency, intelligence, and the capacity for strategic resistance. Her research revealed a central truth that no one could dispute, but the reaction of the academic community was mixed. Some historians praised her work for shedding light on a form of resistance that had been systematically erased from historical narratives, while others criticized her for possibly glorifying violence or for speculating about details that could not be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. There is no memorial to Silas in South Carolina today, no historical marker describing what transpired in the Low Country between 1836 and 1847, and the plantations where he worked have mostly vanished, replaced by suburban development or reclaimed by forest. The sexual violence that he endured that led him to his terrible retaliation was endemic to the slavery system, and resistance to that violence, though frequently concealed or disguised, was far more common than historical records suggested. In some communities, especially among descendants of enslaved people in the Low Country, the story of Silas the Silent has been passed down orally. The courthouse where he was interrogated still stands, but it is now a museum that focuses on more palatable aspects of the region's history, such as Revolutionary War heroes, antebellum architecture, and natural beauty. The darker stories, the ones that reveal the true human cost of slavery, are largely left out of official historical narratives. It is sometimes told as a ghost story, sometimes as a story of vengeance from beyond the grave, sometimes as a warning about what happens when oppressive systems become so cruel that resistance is unavoidable at all costs, and sometimes as a story of justice, imperfect, terrible, but justice nonetheless, enacted by someone who had no other option, no other way to give his suffering meaning. Historians and ethicists continue to debate whether Silas was a victim, a villain, or something more complex than either category allows. He did not kill anyone, but he caused 8 men to suffer horrific injuries as retaliation for sexual violence he had endured repeatedly over almost 2 decades. Does that make him a hero, a criminal, or a sign of a system so morally bankrupt that it allowed such desperate acts? The answer may depend on your belief in justice. The historical reality that Silas's story represents cannot be disputed. He was one person, but his experience was shared by countless thousands who were never named, never remembered, whose resistance, whether through violence, flight, sabotage, or simple survival, has been systematically erased from the record. Other questions include whether revenge can ever be righteous and whether a person who has been denied all legal protection and human dignity can be judged by the standards of a society that refused to acknowledge their humanity in the first place. What do you think of this story? Was Silas justified in what he did? Every plantation had its secrets, its hidden violence, its buried stories. The only thing that makes Silas unique is that his story was eventually revealed, preserved in sealed documents and private journals by people who understood that the truth, no matter how horrible, deserved to be remembered. What other kind of justice might have been available to him? Please share your thoughts in the comments section below. These historical discussions are important because they make us face difficult realities about our past. If you enjoyed this story and would like to see more in-depth explorations of the shadowy areas of American history, please subscribe to this channel and hit that alert bell to ensure you don't miss any videos. Give this to someone who enjoys history without looking away from the most difficult realities. Additionally, keep in mind that these are not only historical tales. They serve as the cornerstones of the current, recurring trends that span generations. Knowing them is the first step in making sure they don't happen again. Till the next time, never stop learning, never stop asking questions, and never forget that there were actual individuals with actual lives, real agony, and real lives behind every historical statistic. Occasionally, they made awful decisions that were entirely reasonable given their dire situation.